Hello and welcome to NewsClick. I'm Paranjoy Guha Thakurta, and today we are going to discuss Afghanistan. With me here from Kathmandu in Nepal, I have Anohita Mojumdar. She's a senior journalist who follows what is happening in Afghanistan. She's lived in Kabul and traveled across Afghanistan. She's lived there for around 8 years, from the end of 2003 to early 2012. She's a former editor of Himal South Asia, the magazine and the portal, and she's following what's going on in Afghanistan. Anuhita, what we are today witnessing, and I'm going by reports in different media, is scenes of chaos at Kabul airport on Monday. On Sunday, India's Independence Day, the Taliban occupied Kabul, entered the capital of Afghanistan virtually unopposed. The president, or the former president, I should say perhaps, Ashraf Ghani, he left Afghanistan on Sunday, ostensibly because he said he wanted to avoid bloodshed. Now we've got amazing scenes happening. I mean, there are thousands of people on the runway, on the tarmac of Kabul. We hear there have been over 100 Indians, including personnel of the ITBP, the Indo-Tibetan Border Police, who are in Afghanistan. And the scenes are absolutely horrifying and crazy. But what we have, as I'm talking to you a short while ago, a statement that has come from the spokesperson of the Russian embassy. And it says that Ashraf Ghani left Kabul in a helicopter and 4 cars. I don't know how he could have been in cars and in a helicopter, but apparently he was carrying huge amounts of cash. He was carrying so much cash that he had to leave some behind on the tarmac, as it wouldn't all fit in. So this is a new development that we've seen happening on Monday evening as we record this program. As a senior journalist who watched very carefully from very close quarters what's happening in Afghanistan, could you, for the benefit of our viewers, quickly recap what has happened in recent times, in recent weeks, and to what extent was what we are seeing today expected?
I think, Paranjoy, the speed with which the provinces have fallen to the Taliban and now the capital, Kabul, that has taken everybody by surprise. But that being said, I think what is surprising is the short period of time in which they have been able to take over in the country. The fact that they have been able to take over is not a surprise to those who have been observing what has been happening in Afghanistan, not just in recent weeks and months, but actually over a period of years. In many parts of the country, the Taliban were in control, and the government had only nominal control in a large part of the country. In many areas, there was also there were agreements which were brokered by the local tribal leaders, basically persuading both the Taliban and the government to keep their forces at bay and not engage in fights. So there was a kind of holding pattern in many areas. So I think the fact that they have now taken over after the American troops have led, and the American troops have also, despite what they may claim, have not done a proper handover, as you perhaps know. They left very stealthily from Bagram, the base outside Kabul, which even shocked, I think, Afghans that they would leave in the middle of the night and leave the Bagram air base virtually unattended. So I think the speed with which they have left without a proper handover has also enabled this. On the political front, I think the fact that the US went ahead and made a deal with the Taliban and that the Afghan government was not a part of the talks or the deal, that had considerably weakened the Afghan government's authority and had strengthened the Taliban. I think in a place like Afghanistan, apart from we see now the discussion about the Afghan army, the strength of the Afghan army and its equipment, but I think morale has a big part to play. And I think the US deal unfortunately strengthened the morale of the Taliban and weakened that of the government. There are other factors which we can go into further in this
No, I
discussion.
want you to elaborate on one point you made. You are suggesting that there was some sort of a understanding, covert or otherwise, between the Americans and the Taliban. Now, this is contrary to what a lot of people believe. At the same time, there's also a lot of criticism of the Joe Biden administration for literally as suddenly going away. And after American forces and the forces of its allies in the NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, were entrenched there for 20 years. Suddenly, as you said a little while ago, the sheer speed, the sheer rapidity with which the Taliban has evidently acquired control of that entire landlocked mountainous country has really surprised quite a few people.
So the deal I'm talking about actually, Paranjoy, is the one which is very public, where there was an agreement on the part of the American forces to withdraw their troops in exchange for guarantees by the Taliban that the territory of Afghanistan will not be used by them to launch any attacks on the US or its allies. There were several other conditions relating to violence by the Taliban, etc. But these were virtually ignored in terms of the implementation of the deal. The US government did not enforce anything on the Taliban, and the limited purpose seems to have been to have some kind of a face savings gesture which allowed them to leave the country. When you talk about 20 years of the American and NATO presence, I think that has also been a very uh, different phases of it. Right at the beginning in 2001, when there was a suggestion that the NATO allies should be brought in, the Americans were very insistent that the footprint should remain confined to just American forces. At that point, if you remember, they were trying to hunt for bin Laden and the Taliban, and in the words of the then American President George W. Bush, smoked them out of the caves, etc., etc. And they didn't really want anybody getting in the way. Subsequently, NATO allies were brought in, and the footprint of the forces was expanded. But it has very much been an American led project, which has been dictated by America's very narrow political agenda at all times. And in the last phase, which actually perhaps started even while I was there, though that's quite some time ago, there was this attempt to build up an Afghan army. Now, in Afghanistan, what has happened all along on various fronts, but in this particular case, I'm talking about the Afghan army, there was a date and there was a number which was conjured up. I'm not sure on the basis of what. And so-called Afghan army was set up without adequate training, without adequate command and control structures. You cannot build an army for a nation overnight at that scale and not have some problems. And I think those problems were pointed out at that time. But I think with Afghanistan, the last 20 years have been more about ticking boxes on time rather than actually looking at the reality on the ground.
Tell me, Anohita, do you see a continuity in American policy towards Afghanistan? George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., Trump, Obama before Trump, Obama, and now Biden. I mean, is it that there is not even, I mean, you don't make out even much of a nuance in the way in which successive American administrations over the last 2 decades have looked on Afghanistan? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
I think there are different phases in the domestic policy of the US insofar as it has impacted on Afghanistan. So I would say that the Bush administrations perhaps had more of a desire to get into Afghanistan and change things, whereas Obama himself wanted to curtail the number of troops. And he didn't really do it to the extent that he had thought he would. And Biden has followed in Obama's vein by reining in the number of troops and bringing it now down to zero. Now, of course, he is following, policies which were put in place by his predecessor, President Donald Trump. But Biden has also he has picked and chosen which of the policies of Trump he wants to follow through on, which ones he wants to disband. In this particular case, I think there is no appetite for continuing in Afghanistan within the domestic sphere of US politics. And he probably felt that he would lose a lot of goodwill, which he had when he came into power, if he allowed this to continue, because at the time that he took office, things were in quite a bad shape in Afghanistan, and there was no easy way out. Would he have taken this step if he had known that it would result in the kind of scenes that you have just described? Would he have taken that step with alacrity if he had known exactly this? I don't know. The fact
Let me
that these
interrupt you.
scenes would come into place at some point was known, but perhaps he thought that there would be enough of a gap so for the US administration to wash its hands off and blame it on the Afghans.
No,
But
one
right
minute.
now, clearly,
The Biden administration is being criticized from different quarters for having not been unable to anticipate what would happen. Okay, there is a certain continuity and there's also certain changes. And yes, the domestic politics of the US also dictates the American government or the administration's the way it looks on Afghanistan. But the question that is being asking, by leaving a fairly substantial section of the Afghan population, which was opposed to the Taliban, virtually in the lurch, and not being able to anticipate what would happen, is seen as to be a major failure of the Biden administration. Would you agree?
not entirely, Paranjoy. Like I said, I think this could be foreseen. And anybody who's following Afghanistan, including American advisors, American policy experts, they have anticipated this. The only thing not anticipated was how quickly it would happen. And I'm sure the Biden administration thought that there would be a respectable amount of time, say 6 months or so, which it would take for the government in Kabul to fall, at which point they could much more easily blame it on Afghan
Okay.
infighting,
All
the
right.
shortcomings of the Afghan government, whereas right now it has come straight on the heels of the departure of the American forces, and therefore it's more obviously and blatantly being linked to them.
Okay. The same criticism is now being leveled at New Delhi. Yes, the process of evacuating Indians and persons of Indian origin from different parts of Afghanistan had started some time back. Well, some time back. But the very fact that you even today, according to news reports, have 200 odd Indians stationed in Afghanistan, including, I was told, about 100 odd personnel of the Indo-Tibetan Border Police. Now, the criticism is that the government of India should also have anticipated what would happen and evacuated these individuals and these people earlier than it did. Would you go along with that criticism?
I think the last few weeks have been unprecedented, and I really don't think anybody was predicting that Kabul would fall quite so quickly. So, to give the Indian government the benefit of doubt. But I do think that in the last few days, as provinces were falling really quickly, and the approach to Kabul after Ghazni felt, it became clear that it would fall very quickly. So I don't know the logistics of whether they
Okay.
could have moved out people in the last few days before Kabul fell. But I would say that the rapidity has taken everybody by
All right.
surprise.
Okay. Anuhita, what does recent developments tell you about India's policy towards Afghanistan? The Narendra Modi government over the last 7 years, its policies towards Afghanistan. How would you evaluate these?
not just this government, but overall, India's strategy towards Afghanistan is also determined by its strategy towards Pakistan. There is perhaps not such a great reason for India's intense engagement, the amount of aid it provides, the number of consulates it has, and the number of projects. Of course, the official line is that this is, country to country goodwill, but India does not exhibit that kind of goodwill towards any other country. So I think one must accept the fact that it is guided by the fact that of its Afghanistan's proximity to Pakistan. And this narrow approach, I think, has not really helped. India has failed to, the Indian government, I should say, the Indian government has failed to really broaden its contacts with the people, and has also failed to broaden its contacts within the Afghan leadership, casting it very narrowly in terms of who might serve it better vis-a-vis its policy towards Pakistan. And for that reason, also for the longest time, I think India had relied on the US to use its leverage vis-a-vis Pakistan within Afghan policy, rather than really embarking on its own. And I think the fact that as a regional country, I think India could have played a role in bringing a different kind of understanding, whether it's about politics or development or other issues, to Afghanistan. But I think the entire Afghan project of the last 20 years has been led by the US, and that is there is what we are seeing today is largely the result of that.
Okay. Anuhita, what impact do you think recent developments in Afghanistan will have on Pakistan and Imran Khan and the Imran Khan regime?
I don't really know what the impact will be, because as of now, it's very hard to say what this version of Taliban will look like. As we know, the Taliban have in the past found very active support from the government of Pakistan. Over a period of time, the support has wavered, has waned, has been provided by perhaps government groups which are not directly from the government, but supported by the government. Pakistan has its own problem with Taliban within Pakistan. And we really don't know what form or shape of governance the Taliban will undertake within Afghanistan now in their kind of second rendition. So much will depend on that. The Taliban's focus in the past has largely been within the country. They have not been an exporter of terror, like, for example, the Al Qaeda. What happened in the last few years of the Taliban when they were earlier in power was very much at the behest of Al Qaeda. For example, the blowing up of the Bamiyan Buddhas that happened in 2001, whereas
March
Taliban.
2001. I'm going to come to that in a short while from now. But I wanted to ask you the impact on Kashmir, militancy in the Kashmir Valley. Do you expect, as some do, that what has happened in Afghanistan would result in an escalation of tensions in the Kashmir Valley?
I don't know, Paranjoy. I have covered Kashmir in the past, but I don't follow this issue very closely
Okay.
now. So I wouldn't like to speculate on that. When I was covering Kashmir, there were all these stories of Afghan fighters coming in, but I don't know how much of that was actual fact. I mean, there are the Pashtun people on either side of the Durand line have similarities of culture, of language. So one doesn't know whether all of them were actually Afghans who were being sent there or not. And also at that point, like I said, the Al Qaeda had a big influence
Okay.
within Afghanistan. So it really depends on how the new governance of this Taliban shapes up.
All right. Let me ask you, let me go back in time. Uh, Afghanistan, in more ways than one, is a unique part of the world. We know it's landlocked. We know it's largely mountainous. We know you know, it's like the intersection of Central Asia and South Asia. It's bordered on the east and the south by Pakistan, Iran on the west, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan on the north, China on the northwest. And if you look back in time, it is often said that Afghanistan is unconquerable. And in fact, it is supposed to be the graveyard of empires. People talk about, how Afghanistan was a buffer in the great game, quote unquote, great game between British India and the Russian Empire. But from the days of Alexander the Great to the Mauryas, to the Mughals, to the Muslim Arabs, to the Mongols, to the British, to the Soviets, to the Americans, all of them have failed to, quote unquote, conquer Afghanistan. Your views?
Well, I really hope that nobody can and ever will conquer Afghanistan, because I think that's a historical term which should have been outdated long ago. But phrases like graveyard of empires, etc., yeah, it's sometimes also very lazy cliches that we journalists like to use because it's difficult to explain complex concepts. But I think certainly they are a very independent minded people. And I think the attempts to impose different kinds of projects and different kinds of, you know, different kinds of values have met their comeuppance in Afghanistan. But I would say this also happens within Afghanistan. There are multiple cultures, and I think the attempts to impose the culture of one part of the country on another has also met with resistance. So the reason why I think the international intervention in 2001 was welcomed by a large part of the Afghan population was because they did not like the kind of culture which was being imposed on them. And they were used to greater freedoms, individual freedoms, and they did not like this kind of an imposition. So I think, yes, they are definitely very independent in wanting to determine their own path.
Okay. We all know that Afghanistan has very high levels of impoverishment. Education, healthcare facilities are inadequate. Child malnutrition is prevalent. Corruption. Lot of the acquisition of arms has been on account of the opium trade, and Afghanistan happens to be very much a part of that so-called golden triangle. So we see here a country which is also, as you mentioned earlier, not a homogeneous country. There are many ethnic groups, many things, and often they've been at war. There's been civil strife, civil war. But juxtapose that with the socio-economic conditions that have been prevailing in Afghanistan for a fairly long period of time, for several decades, if not even more than that. How do you reflect on these aspects of Afghanistan?
I think Afghanistan has been in conflict now. We're entering the fifth decade of conflict. The Americans keep talking about the forever war and how they could not, the conflict has, they've been there for 2 decades, but Afghans are in the fifth decade of conflict. And that has had a real toll on the people. And unfortunately, I think efforts to revive the economy have been very ad hoc, and they have not taken the uh, health of the economy into account. So again, we have a very project-led approach towards the Afghan economy, and you probably
India
know
builds
that.
a dam, India builds roads, etc., etc.
I think every country has had its own set of priorities, and I think a lot of the development aid provided by a lot of the Western countries, for example, followed uh, their military troop movement, so they were spending money where their troops were, rather than looking at the health of the entire country. And Afghanistan is primarily an agrarian country, so efforts should have been made to bring that back to where it could provide subsistence
Okay.
living, rather than perhaps some fancier economic projects.
Okay. Anuhita, it's not just Afghanistan as a country, but the Taliban has been negatively stereotyped, I could argue, in the international media, including in India. And these kind of stereotypes get reinforced. You mentioned earlier in our conversation about the Bamiyan Buddhas, the amazing 6th century carvings in the middle on a mountainside that was carved in, which was blown up in March 2001. Now, that's one part. The other is the treatment of women. And in the international media, there's a surfeit of horror stories which would seek to tell you how terrible, how regressive, how fundamentalist the Taliban are. Your opinion?
I think the women of Afghanistan have been used again and again as a tool for to pursue various political projects. So again, if we are looking at Afghanistan, I think the culture of women throughout the country is extremely different. Kabul was a city which was much more cosmopolitan than our capitals, a century ago. But in parts of the deep south in Afghanistan, the culture is much more conservative, and they would observe parda, which in their case would be the burqa, for any time they stepped out of the house. And some women, in some parts, women don't go out without an escort. But this is also part of the local culture. What the Taliban did was try to impose their version of having women, not having women in the public space without escort, and without the proper, what they would consider the proper attire throughout the country, which, like I said, was not acceptable to large parts of the country. But I think in order to pursue a political project, they have not really looked at the Taliban. And I would argue that even if, from a strategic point of view, somebody is viewing the Taliban as an enemy, I think it's important to be realistic about actually, what the enemy is like. And I think the rush to demonization has conflated women's rights with this picture of the Taliban, which it's much more nuanced. So I'll give you two examples which might be surprising to most people. The Pashtun Wali Code, which is the code of the law governing Pashtun tribes, talks about Baad and Badal, where you exchange women from two families, or you give women in exchange for a certain transaction or a certain crime. Now, the Taliban had actually put an end to both these practices because they said that this was against the Sharia. Similarly, they have, in the last few years, in many areas where they have had control, they have put an end to this exorbitant bride prices that are prevalent in Afghanistan. So I think a more nuanced appreciation of their character, and much of it is extremely regressive because they are imposing the culture as a state party on areas of Afghanistan where the culture is very different. It needs to be considered, but it's more nuanced than most people understand it to be.
Okay. We are almost at the end of our conversation, Anuhita. I have two last questions for you. I'll look back again, and then I'll ask you to look ahead. Look back. Look, there's a long history. I'm not an expert on the subject. 1919, the Third Anglo-Afghan War, monarchy, King Amanullah, then Zahid Shah. For about half a century, you had the monarchy. And then we see gradually changes happening. Late 70s, the Soviets come in, 1978. 80s, the fight with the Mujahideen. Then we see by the mid 90s, much of Afghanistan has been captured by the Mujahideen. We know what happened to Najibullah and the terrible way he died. I mean, I don't know. I mean, people are today contrasting Ashraf Ghani's fleeing his country with what happened to uh, Najibullah. But the and then of course the US invasion comes in 2001. When you look back, how do you then contextualize what is happening today in the history, in the history, given the history, the very troubled history and the checkered history of Afghanistan? And from here, I'd ask you to reflect what is likely to happen in the near future.
I think, unfortunately, Afghanistan has also not been allowed to pursue its own destiny by various countries. And Afghans are always blamed for the violence within their country, but they have never really been left alone. You talked about how Afghanistan was a buffer, between the Tsarist Russia and the British Empire. And I think all along it's been seen as a staging post for various ambitions in the region and outside the region as well. So if Afghans were given a chance, we would, things might be very different. Looking ahead, it's very, very difficult at this point of time to predict anything. But I have friends who are in Afghanistan and friends who are also not all are trying to leave the country. They feel like it's their country and they are there to stay and work for the country. So I think the hope must rest with people that the Afghan people get the kind of governance and political leadership that they deserve.
Thank you so much, Onohita, for
Thank you.
sharing your thoughts, your views on what is happening in Afghanistan. And as you rightly pointed out, it's extremely difficult to predict where what will happen in the near future. And we all hope that the people of Afghanistan will have a greater say in shaping their destiny. Thank you once again for being with us. And all of you who've been watching this program, do keep watching NewsClick.